The phone rang at dawn. I sat on the screened porch, coffee gone cold, watching pelicans work the shallows of Apalachicola Bay. My ex-wife, Diane. FBI raided the house, Lorne. Trent's in handcuffs. Bryce. They're saying federal charges. Our son, Lorne. Federal charges. Trent. The man she'd traded me for. Our son. She hadn't called him that in 2 years. Come home, please. I watched a pelican dive and come up with nothing. One moment. Please subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Your presence here truly matters. My name is Lorne Kessler, 56 years old. For 32 of those years, I built timber frames by hand. Post and beam houses joined with hand-cut mortise and tenon joinery that other builders drove hours to study. Now I build boats on the Gulf Coast and don't answer my phone when Minnesota calls. To understand how I got here, you need to know where I started. Duluth, Minnesota. January 1988. I was 18 with no money and no college applications and hands that wouldn't stay idle. My father, a commercial fisherman on Lake Superior, knew a Norwegian timber framer named Gunnar who worked out of a barn shop on the ridge above the harbor. Gunnar was 61, built like a fence post, forearms roped from decades of swinging a commander's mallet. He'd learned the trade from his father in Trondheim and brought it to the Iron Range in 1954. I showed up on a Tuesday morning, 8 below zero. Wind off the lake at 30 miles an hour. The barn smelled like cut oak and shavings and coffee that never went cold on the wood stove. Tools hung on pegboard by size. Chisels, mallets, draw knives, each one oiled and sharp. Gunnar didn't look up from the beam he was mortising. You, the fisherman's kid? Yes, sir. You drink? No, sir. You quit when it gets hard? No, sir. He pointed his chisel at a pile of white oak timbers frozen to the ground outside. Move those inside. Stack them along the north wall. All of them. Each one weighed close to 300 pounds. Took me 4 hours. By the time I dragged the last timber through the barn doors, my gloves were shredded and the muscles in my back were gone. Gunnar poured me coffee and handed me a broad-head chisel. Cut that mortise, he said, tapping a line he'd scribed on the nearest beam. Follow the line. Don't go past it. I butchered it. Ragged walls, uneven depth, corners that looked chewed. Gunnar studied my work. A joint cut right holds for centuries, he said. Cut wrong. The whole frame comes down. Not today. Maybe not for 20 years. But it comes down. He placed the chisel back in my hand. Again, he handed me a pile of cutoffs. I cut that same joint 40 times before he let me touch anything that mattered. 6 months in, he stopped me mid-cut on a Wednesday morning. What wood is that? White oak. How old? I ran my hand along the grain. 150 years. Maybe 200. 200 years of growing, he said. And you get one chance to cut it right. Think about that before you touch the chisel. Every time. For 6 years, I worked beside Gunnar in that barn. He taught me the language of wood through repetition, correction, and silence. How white oak fights the chisel, but rewards patience. How Douglas fir splits clean if you read the grain right. How a scarf joint transfers load through geometry alone. No metal, no adhesive, just 2 pieces of timber locked by the precision of the cut. He taught me to read a beam by pressing my thumb against the grain. If the wood pushed back, the timber was sound. If it gave, the rot had already started inside where nobody could see. Surface tells you nothing, he said one afternoon, splitting open a beam I'd cleared for use. The core was brown and soft. Always go deeper than what shows. By 24, I was cutting joints he couldn't tell from his own. By 30, I had commissions across the upper Midwest. By 40, I was the builder other builders called when a historic frame needed restoration or a client wanted a house done the way they did it 200 years ago. Hand-cut joinery, no metal fasteners. Every timber selected and fitted by hand and eye. I kept leather notebooks, breast pocket size, every joint I cut, every problem I solved, every lesson Gunnar drilled into me, I sketched it in pencil. The notebooks filled 2 shelves in my workshop. 30 years of a man thinking with his hands, recorded in worn leather. 3 years on my own after Gunnar. I had my shop, my commissions, and not much else. I met Diane at a friend's cookout in the summer of 1997. She was 25, running the front desk at a dental practice on Superior Street. Sharp laugh, quick eyes, the kind of ambition that kept her heels on at a backyard barbecue. I was 27 with sawdust in my hair and a callus on every finger. Third date, she ran her thumb across my palm. Most guys I meet have soft hands, she said. Yours feel like you actually do something. We married 8 months later. Small ceremony at her parents' church in Minneapolis. Her father, a car dealership manager who'd lost his position when she was 14, gripped my hand at the reception hard enough to mean it. Take care of my girl, he said. I will. That first year, we rented a place on 3rd Street while I cleared the building site, 2 acres on a bluff overlooking Lake Superior, bought with cash from 3 years of saved commissions. Weekends, Diane brought coffee to the lot, and we sat on my tailgate watching the water. Tell me what it's going to look like, she said one October morning, steam rising from her cup. I opened my notebook and pointed to the elevation drawing. Great room here, stone fireplace there. Those east windows catch the sunrise off the lake, and the bedroom faces the water. You'll hear the waves at night. She leaned into my shoulder. How long will it take? As long as it takes to do it right. That's your answer for everything, she said. But she was smiling. 12 years, that's how long. I worked it between client jobs. Nights, weekends, whole weeks when I could swing it. Post and beam construction. Cathedral ceiling in the great room. White oak trusses joined with hand-cut joinery, not a single metal fastener in the frame. I raised the first truss alone, 14 feet of oak lifted with a come-along and a rope system I rigged to the ridge beam. Diane photographed every major step. The ridge beam locking into place. The stone fireplace rising row by row from Lake Superior beach rock. I hauled a truckload at a time, each stone laid with mortar I mixed each morning. The mantel was a slab of white pine from a demolished church in 2 harbors, planed and sanded until the grain showed from across the room. Friday nights during those years, we drove to a fish fry at the VFW in 2 harbors. The place smelled like hot grease and old style, and the pine paneling they'd never bothered to replace. Diane ordered walleye and 2 beers and talked about the patients at the practice. The nervous kid who bit the hygienist, the old man who brought homemade bread to his cleaning appointments. She was sharp-tongued and warm underneath it. I'd sit across the table from her in that vinyl booth and know that my life was right. Our son Bryce was born in 2002. Saturdays shifted from full shop days to half because I coached his mite hockey team at the Duluth Heritage Sports Center starting when he was 5. Never missed a game. Never missed a practice. Drove the team van to tournaments in Grand Rapids and Hibbing. Bought pizza for 10 kids after every road game. Paid out of pocket because some families couldn't swing it. Bryce was 12 when he asked me, riding home from a tournament in Cloquet, Dad, how come we don't have a bigger house like Tyler's? Tyler Bannock was his line mate. Tyler's father sold insurance and lived in a new construction colonial with a 3-car garage. Ours is bigger, I said. Doesn't look bigger. It's built better. That's what counts. He went back to his phone. The mortgage I paid off 8 years ahead of schedule. No car payments, no credit card balances, union pension building since I was 22. Zero debt. My life was built the way I built timber frames. Sound joints, good wood, patience in every direction that counted. None of it registered with Diane. It started at the dental practice where she'd worked the past 16 years. Her boss, Dr. Gerald Thiel, hired a new associate whose wife remodeled their kitchen. Carrara marble countertops, custom cabinetry, a 6-burner Viking range that cost more than our truck. Diane came home that evening and stood in our kitchen a long time, fingers trailing along the laminate counter I'd put in when Bryce was in diapers. She didn't say anything that night. The next morning, she stood in the same spot, coffee in hand, staring at the countertop like it owed her something. Linda Thiel's getting heated bathroom floors, she said a week later. Linda was the dentist's wife. Heated floors, radiant heat under the tile, and here I am using that space heater you bought at Fleet Farm. Space heater works, I said. That's not the point, Lorne. What's the point? She pressed her lips together. Forget it. She didn't forget. She tracked every home sale in a 20-mile radius. Listing prices, closing prices, square footage, lot size. Quoted the numbers from memory, the way I quoted grain densities. She started rearranging our living room furniture every other week. Couch by the window, then against the wall, then angled toward the fireplace. I'd come home from a job, and the room would be different. Just trying something, she'd say. I knew what she was doing. Trying to make our house look like the ones on her phone. The comparisons became a rhythm at the dinner table. Every few days, a new data point. Karen Johansson's daughter got into Northwestern, she said on a Tuesday. Karen was her friend from church choir. Full ride. Karen says it's the school district. Bryce goes to a good school, I said. A good school district, Lorne. There's a difference. There was. $60,000 in property value and a zip code. Margaret's husband took her to Cancun, she said the following week. Margaret Dunn was her college roommate, married to a medical device salesman. Second vacation this year. I kept eating. Julie's getting a sunroom addition. Julie was her neighbor from book club. Hired a contractor. 3 weeks. She looked at me when she said 3 weeks. I'd spent 12 years on our house. The silences grew between the comparisons. Whole evenings where we sat in the same room and she never spoke, phone in hand, scrolling through listings she'd never buy, pinning kitchens and master bathrooms to boards with 4,000 entries. Every Monday morning she spent extra time in the bathroom mirror before driving to the dental office. Every Monday evening she came home and stood in our kitchen like it was evidence of something. My sawdust and flannel and 12-year building projects, all the things she'd once called honest, she'd stopped calling them anything at all. She'd been 14 when her father lost his job, old enough to notice the smaller house, the coupons, the canceled vacations, old enough to keep score. Then the line moved. Margaret's husband bought her a new SUV, she said one Sunday morning. Brand new, off the lot. Didn't negotiate, just bought it. I looked up from my coffee. Must be nice, she said. Having a husband who provides. 18 years. A house built beam by beam with my own hands. Mortgage paid off. Son raised. Zero debt. And the word she chose was provides. I picked up my notebook from the counter, opened it to a blank page, drew a dovetail joint for a restoration project in Ely. Clean lines, right angles. Pencil moving the way it always moved. Diane watched me sketch for a moment. Then she went back to her phone. A kitchen remodel in Edina. White countertops. Brass fixtures. Someone else's life. I noticed all of it, and I said nothing. The Duluth Home and Garden Show ran every March at the Convention Center on Waterfront Drive. I never went. Trade shows were for people selling shortcuts, prefab trusses, engineered lumber, vinyl siding that peeled in 3 winters. But Diane pulled 2 tickets from a dental patient who couldn't use them, and I went because she asked. That's where I first saw Trent Marquis. He stood at the far end of the exhibition hall behind a booth built to look like a luxury kitchen, marble countertop on a false wall, pendant lights hung from nothing, before and after photos blown up to poster size. Spray-tanned in March, blazer over an untucked dress shirt, teeth so white they looked like they came from a box. He had the handshake of someone who'd never gripped anything heavier than a cocktail glass. I watched him work the crowd. The pitch came fast and polished. He pointed at the before photos, rotting siding, overgrown lots, cracked foundations, then swept his hand toward the afters. New kitchens, recessed lighting, countertops that reflected the pendant lights like still water. Total transformation, he kept saying. Total transformation in 90 days. Diane stopped walking. I kept going 3 steps before I realized she wasn't beside me anymore. When I turned back, she was standing at his booth with her arms crossed, studying the photographs the way she studied listing prices. Trent noticed her looking. He walked over with that salesman's smile, hand extended. Trent Marquis, Marquis Luxury Renovations. Diane Kessler, you've got a good eye, he said. I can tell by the way you're looking at that kitchen. She laughed, the sharp, quick laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I stood 10 feet away, holding 2 paper cups of bad coffee, watching a man with soft hands sell my wife a version of life I never offered and never would. He didn't notice me standing there. Neither did she. 2 weeks later, Diane drove 40 minutes to attend one of his open houses in 2 harbors. 49 years old, according to the glossy brochure she brought home, she tucked his business card into the mirror above her dresser. The next weekend, she went to another one, then another. She started quoting his listing prices the way she used to quote our neighbors, except now the numbers were 6 and 7 figures. The Lakeside Drive property closed at $1.2 million, she said on a Wednesday evening. He bought it for $300,000 and flipped it in 4 months. I was sharpening a chisel at the kitchen table. I didn't look up. 4 months, Lorne. I heard you. Do you understand what that means? $900,000 in 4 months means he didn't fix what needed fixing. What? Nobody turns a house in 4 months unless they're covering problems, not solving them. She stared at me. You don't even know him. I know the math. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened one of his listings. Scrolled through the photos. New siding over old sheathing. Drywall over plaster. Paint over stains. Everything bright and smooth and fast. This is what people want, she said. This. Not 12 years of sawdust. The comparisons had stacked up for months. Dental office kitchens, neighbors' vacations, heated bathroom floors. But those were aimed at the gap between us and other couples. This was different. Now there was a name attached. A face. A man whose business model was the opposite of everything I'd spent 32 years perfecting. The cruelty came out at dinner. Not all at once. In pieces, the way rot works. He builds 12 houses in a year, she said on a Thursday night. You built one in 12. I cut my steak and said nothing. I'm not trying to be mean, Lorne. I'm stating a fact. You're stating a number, I said. Doesn't make it a fact. Her fork hit the plate. What does that even mean? Means I've been inside houses like his. Every one of them has something wrong. you can't see from the listing photos. You've never been inside one of his houses. I don't need to. She pushed back from the table. That's your problem. You think you know everything from looking at a piece of wood. The world moved on, Lorne. It moved on, and you didn't. That became the rhythm. 2. 3 times a week, Trent's name at the dinner table like a guest who never left. His properties, his success, his confidence. The kitchen clock ticked through every word of it. She rearranged her Pinterest boards, all 4,000 pins reorganized around his design style. Open concepts, waterfall countertops, statement lighting. She started dropping new words into conversation, words she'd picked up from his open houses and brochures. We should think about investment properties, she said one Sunday morning. We don't have investment property money. Trent says the whole game is other people's money. You don't need your own. You need a willing lender and a good eye. Trent says. Her jaw tightened. Yes, Trent says, because Trent actually understands how money works. Money works like wood, I said. Borrow against what you can't afford, and the whole thing goes soft. You just can't see it yet. She didn't answer. Went back to her phone. An infinity pool somewhere. A lake house she'd never own. By fall, she'd stopped comparing us to the neighbors. The only comparison that mattered had a name and a booth at the convention center. Our son Bryce was 23 by then. He'd lasted 1 semester at Lake Superior College before dropping out, said the classes didn't apply to anything real. Cycled through a stockroom job at the sporting goods store on Central Entrance, then 4 months at a restaurant downtown, then nothing. He lived in an apartment I paid for off Piedmont Avenue, played video games until 2 in the afternoon, and called me when his car needed work. I tried, got him into the shop twice, showed him how to read grain, how to hold a chisel, how to scribe a lime. His hands were versions of mine, same width, same length, but they held the tools like foreign objects. After an hour, he checked his phone and said he had somewhere to be. He saw Trent for the first time at Diane's birthday dinner. She'd invited him. My own wife invited another man to the table and introduced him to our son while I sat there cutting a piece of cake. Trent, this is Bryce, Diane said. Bryce, Trent is the one I've been telling you about. Trent shook my son's hand the same way he shook everyone's. Big smile, strong grip, eye contact held a beat too long. Your mom tells me you're looking for the right opportunity, Trent said. Bryce straightened up. Yeah, something with growth potential. Growth potential. My son had never used those words in his life. Within a week, Trent offered Bryce a position. Junior partner at Marquis Luxury Renovations. Business cards, a company email, access to the properties. The title sounded like it meant something. It didn't. What it meant was Bryce's name on documents, inspection reports, lender draw requests, completion certificates. A second signature for paperwork Trent needed a second name on. Bryce didn't read any of it. Signed, where Trent pointed, proud of the pen in his hand. The sneakers and hoodies disappeared. He showed up to Sunday dinner in an ill-fitting blazer and too much cologne. Started talking about square footage and market rates and blue ocean strategy, phrases that came out of his mouth with the mechanical cadence of memorized lines. Trent gave him keys to a leased Audi, heated seats, heads-up display, the company name on the registration. Every junior partner needs to look the part, Trent had told him. My son took a photo with the car keys and posted it to every platform he had. The last dinner happened in October. Diane cooked pot roast, which she only did when she wanted something to feel normal. Bryce arrived in the blazer, cologne trailing him through the front door. He sat at the table I'd built from a single slab of white ash and pulled his phone out before his plate was full. For 20 minutes, we ate in a silence broken only by forks and the ticking of the kitchen clock. Diane looked at me, then at Bryce, then back at me, measuring something. I got promoted, Bryce said. He hadn't been promoted. He'd been given a new line on a business card. Good for you, I said. Trent's putting me on the Lakeshore project. 6.2 million listing. That's the big one. I've heard. He put his fork down. You don't even care, do you? I care. No, you don't. You never cared about anything that wasn't made out of wood. Bryce, Diane said, half a warning, half permission. This guy is rich, Dad. Not like you. He drives a new car every 6 months. He takes people to dinner at places with cloth napkins. And he didn't spend 30 years cutting mortises nobody asked for. Diane didn't contradict him, sat there with her hands in her lap, and let our son tear apart everything I'd built for this family. The house around us, the table under his elbows, the 23 years of coaching and meals and rent checks and patience that brought him to this chair where he could sit in a borrowed blazer and tell me I wasn't enough. I set my fork down, studied his face. Same jaw I saw in the mirror every morning, same hands. But his eyes had gone somewhere I couldn't reach, somewhere Trent had filled with the promise of fast money and status without calluses. I'd seen it in wood 100 times. The moment the grain changes and the core goes soft, the surface still holds its shape, still looks like it can bear weight, but press your thumb against it and you feel the give, and you know the structure is already compromised from the inside out. No amount of finish or polish changes what's happening underneath. My son had gone soft, and the woman I'd married watched it happen and said nothing. Finish your dinner, I said. Bryce pushed his chair back. I'm done, he left in the Audi. Trent's Audi. Diane cleared the plates without looking at me. I washed them by hand, the way I always did. She dried them and put them away, and we moved around each other in the kitchen like two people sharing a house, which is all we were by then. The divorce papers came 6 weeks later. She filed on a Monday. I know because I was marking a king post truss in my shop when the process server pulled into my driveway. I read every page, signed every page, didn't contest a single line. 28 years. A house built beam by beam. A son raised from the ground up. And she chose the man with the spray tan and the soft hands and the properties that looked right in photographs but wouldn't survive a hard winter. I sat in my shop that night with the signed papers on the workbench next to my chisels, ran my thumb along the edge of a white oak beam. The wood pushed back, sound timber, good grain, 200 years of growing, and it would hold for 200 more. The family I built wasn't made of wood. That was the problem. Wood I could read. Wood I could trust. People rot in directions you can't predict. The divorce was final in December. Judge signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in my shop cutting a scarf joint for a restoration project in Ely. My attorney left a voicemail. I listened to it once, set my phone on the workbench, and went back to the joint. The wood didn't care about court dates. Neither did I. Diane kept the house. My house. 12 years of hand-cut joinery, Lake Superior beach rock hauled a truckload at a time, cathedral ceiling with white oak trusses I raised alone. The judge called it marital property. 28 years of marriage made it half hers, and since she was staying in Duluth, the court gave her residence. Paul Lindgren, my attorney, a quiet man who'd handled my business contracts for 15 years, told me I was throwing away $240,000 in equity. You built that house, beam by beam, he said. Fight for it. No. Lorne, if I fight, she sells it to pay her lawyers. Trent buys it at auction for 60 cents on the dollar. Either way, someone else lives in it. I'd rather just be done. Paul closed the folder and didn't push. I rented a room above a hardware store on First Street. One room, a bathroom, a hot plate. The kind of place a man lives when he's decided comfort doesn't matter. Hung my chisels on a pegboard, same as Gunnar had. Put the leather notebooks on a shelf by the window. 2 shelves of them. 30 years of a man's life recorded in worn leather and pencil. The shop was still mine. 4,000 square feet of heated workspace on the ridge above the harbor, same road where Gunnar's barn had stood before it burned in 2004. Diane's attorneys had tried for it in the settlement, called it a marital asset, said the business income funded the marriage. Paul blocked that. The shop was in my name before we married. Premarital property, the one thing the law couldn't hand over. I worked. That's what I did, what I'd always done when everything else failed. The Ely restoration kept me busy through January, a 100-year-old farmhouse with a cracked king post truss and footings that had shifted over a century of freeze-thaw. The kind of job that required weeks of assessment before you touched a single timber. I drove up 3 times a week, 2 hours each way, headlights cutting through dark mornings on Highway 1. Gunnar used to say work was the only honest conversation a man could have with the world. You put in the effort. The wood answered. No politics, no negotiation, no deception. Just the chisel and the grain and the truth of whether your joint was right or wrong. I needed that conversation. February brought a phone call that changed things. Tom Pressman, a building inspector I'd known 20 years, solid man who'd been checking foundations in St. Louis County since the 90s, called on a Thursday morning. Got a situation, he said. Couple up on Lakeshore Drive bought a renovated house last September. Place looked perfect in the photos. Now they've got water in the basement, cracks in the drywall, and their contractor won't return calls. Who renovated it? Marquis Luxury Renovations. I held the phone against my ear for a long time. The couple wants someone who knows structural work to come look, Tom said. Give them a real assessment. I told them, you're the best in the county. Send me the address. The house on Lakeshore Drive was a 1940s Cape Cod that somebody had tried to turn into something it was never meant to be. Open concept, main floor where load-bearing walls used to stand. A kitchen island floating over a subfloor that dipped 2 inches in 3 feet. New siding nailed over rotting sheathing. Recessed lighting cut into ceiling joists that had been notched beyond structural tolerance. The couple, Dave and Sarah Kinnick, both teachers at Denfeld High School, stood in their kitchen while I worked. They paid $370,000 for the house. Their entire savings plus a 30-year mortgage. I didn't give them my opinion. I gave them measurements. The main beam supporting the second floor had been cut through to run HVAC ductwork. Not notched. Cut. A 6x10 white oak beam reduced to 3 inches of remaining cross-section, then covered with drywall and crown molding. From the finished side, the room looked like a magazine cover. From underneath, in the crawl space where I spent 40 minutes on my back with a flashlight, the beam was 14 months from failure. What does that mean? Dave asked when I came back upstairs. It means the floor above your head is being held up by drywall screws and wishful thinking. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table. Dave stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders. Can it be fixed? He asked. Everything can be fixed. The question is what it costs. I wrote a report, 14 pages. Documented every shortcut, every code violation, Every structural problem hidden behind new finishes and fresh paint. The beam, the missing shear walls, the undersized footings, the electrical work done without permits, $72,000 in repairs, minimum, to make the house safe to live in. Tom filed the report with the county. Building department opened an investigation into Marquis luxury renovations. Word traveled fast in Duluth. Within a week, 2 more homeowners called me. Same story. Trent's company had renovated their properties. Same cosmetic perfection, same structural rot underneath. I inspected both houses, wrote 2 more reports, filed them with Tom. The county investigation expanded. 3 properties became 7. 7 became 12. Every house Trent touched had the same pattern. Beautiful surfaces hiding work that would fail within 5 to 10 years. Undersized lumber. Missing fasteners. Load paths interrupted so the room would photograph better. The kind of building that looks right in a listing photo but wouldn't survive a Minnesota winter 20 years running. I thought about what Gunnar had said 30 years ago, splitting open that beam with the soft core. Surface tells you nothing. Always go deeper than what shows. Trent had built a business on surfaces. And underneath every one of them, the structure was giving way. The phone calls started 3 days after the investigation went public. First one came at 6 in the morning. Unknown number. I answered because in my line of work, early calls sometimes mean a client's project has a problem. You need to stop, a man's voice. Not Trent's. Someone else. Who is this? A friend. Giving you advice. Drop the inspections. Walk away. I hung up. Second call came that night. Same voice. The county investigation is one thing. You going house to house looking for problems is another. People are going to think you've got a personal grudge. I have a personal grudge, I said. I also have 14 pages of structural deficiencies that could kill someone. Which one matters more? He hung up. The third call wasn't a phone call. It was Bryce. He showed up at my shop on a Friday afternoon. First time in 4 months. Still wearing the blazer. Still smelling like too much cologne. But something had changed in his face. The softness was gone, replaced by something tight and rehearsed. You need to stop going after Trent, he said. Standing in the doorway of my shop, hands in his pockets, not stepping inside. I set down the draw knife I was holding. Come in. I'm not staying. I came to tell you to stop. Bryce, 12 families are suing him. His insurance got canceled. The bank froze his operating line. You did this. The county building inspector did this. I wrote reports. You went looking for problems because you're mad about Mom. I let that sit for a moment. The shop was quiet. Wind off the lake pressed against the walls. I went looking because a building inspector asked me to assess a house where 2 teachers spent their life savings. The beam holding up their second floor was cut in half and covered with drywall. That's not a grudge. That's a fact. Trent says those houses passed inspection when they sold. Trent's inspector was signing off on work he never looked at. That's part of the investigation. Bryce's jaw worked. Same jaw as mine. Same hands shoved in those blazer pockets. You're going to ruin him, he said. He ruined those houses. I'm just the one who opened the walls. And what happens to me? I'm a junior partner. My name is on those documents. Inspection reports. Completion certificates. There it was. I'd wondered when he'd realize what those signatures meant. Not status. Not partnership. Liability. Trent hadn't given Bryce a career. He'd given him a paper trail. How many did you sign? I asked. I don't know. A lot. He said it was standard. Did you read any of them? They were just forms. They were certifications, Bryce. Your signature says you verified the work was done to code. His face changed. The rehearsed anger broke for a second, and underneath it, I saw what I hadn't seen since he was 12 years old, riding home from a hockey tournament. A kid who didn't understand what was happening to him. What do I do? He asked. His voice dropped to something close to what it used to sound like. Get a lawyer. Not Trent's lawyer. Your own. Tell them everything you signed and everything you knew. I didn't know anything. He just handed me the papers. Then tell a lawyer that. Tonight. He stood in the doorway for another 10 seconds. Then he straightened the blazer, and the rehearsed look came back. Mom says you're doing this to punish her. Your mother can think what she wants. She's happy, Dad. For the first time in years, she's happy. And you can't stand it. I picked up the draw knife. Turned back to the beam on my workbench. Red oak, 200 years old, commissioned for a farmhouse restoration near Ely. Get a lawyer, Bryce. He left. The Audi's engine faded down the ridge road. I worked until midnight. Cut a scarf joint so tight you couldn't fit a piece of paper between the mating surfaces. Then I sat on a stool in the cold shop and stared at my hands. Same hands that held my son when he was born. Same hands that coached his hockey team, drove his friends to tournaments, built the house he grew up in. Those hands couldn't reach him anymore. The investigation grew through March and April. The county referred the case to the state attorney general's office. 12 properties became 19. Homeowners organized. A class action lawsuit was filed against Marquis Luxury Renovations. Trent hired attorneys from Minneapolis, expensive ones, the kind who wore suits that cost more than a month of my commissions. I wasn't part of the lawsuit. I was a witness, the guy who wrote the reports. 3 times I sat in conference rooms and answered questions from lawyers on both sides. What did you find? How did you find it? What are your qualifications? Could the damage have occurred after the renovation? I answered every question the way I answered Gunnar when he asked about wood. With facts. With measurements. With 32 years of knowing what good structure looks like and what happens when someone fakes it. Trent's attorneys tried to discredit me, called me a disgruntled ex-husband with a vendetta, brought up the divorce, suggested my inspections were biased. The structural engineer the state hired matched every finding in my reports. Every cut beam, every missing fastener, every undersized footing. His assessment and mine agreed within a quarter inch on every measurement. Bias doesn't change the numbers. In May, I drove past the house on the bluff. My house. The one I'd built for 12 years. Diane's car was in the driveway. Next to it, Trent's black Escalade. I drove past without stopping. But I saw enough. The stone pathway I'd laid by hand ripped out and replaced with stamped concrete. The white oak front door, hand-planed, fitted with wrought iron hardware I'd bought from a blacksmith in Bayfield, gone. Replaced with a fiberglass door painted to look like wood. He'd moved into the house I'd built beam by beam. And the first thing he did was tear out the real materials and replace them with fakes. I drove to the shop and sat for an hour without touching a tool. Then I called a real estate agent. I want to sell, I said. The shop, the equipment, everything. Kathy Mueller, who'd handled commercial properties on the North Shore for 20 years, came the next day. Walked through the shop, took photos, measured the square footage. This is a lot of specialized equipment, she said. Timber framing tools, the beam saw, the mortising machine. Not a big market for this stuff in Duluth. Price it to move. You sure about this, Lorne? I'm sure. She listed it on a Thursday. By the following Wednesday, a timber framer from Ashland, Wisconsin, drove up to look at it. Young guy, 32, hands that already showed the marks of the trade. He walked through the shop the way I'd walked through Gunnar's barn 36 years ago, studying the tools, running his hand along the workbench, reading the space the way a builder reads a room. "I'll take it," he said. "All of it." We closed in 2 weeks. I packed the leather notebooks into 3 cardboard boxes, 2 shelves worth. 30 years of joints and problems and lessons recorded in pencil. Everything else, the chisels, the mallets, the draw knives, the broad head Gunnar had placed in my hand on that first day, stayed with the shop. Tools belong where the work happens. The notebooks belonged to me. I loaded my truck on a Saturday morning in June. 3 boxes of notebooks, a duffel bag of clothes, my tool roll, a personal set, not the shop equipment. The leather was worn dark from 30 years of use. I didn't tell Diane, didn't tell Bryce. Left a forwarding address with Paul Lindgren in case the attorneys needed me for depositions. Drove south on I-35, through the Iron Range, past the turnoff to Ely where I'd been restoring that farmhouse, past the grain elevators in Duluth Harbor where my father used to dock his fishing boat. Minnesota fell away in the rearview mirror the way a plank drops from a saw. Clean cut, no turning back. I drove for 3 days. Slept at rest stops. Tea at gas stations. Somewhere in Missouri, I stopped checking the rearview. A man I'd met at a timber framing conference 10 years back, Ray Burris, a boat builder in Apalachicola, Florida, had told me once that if I ever wanted a change, his shop had room. Wood is wood, he'd said. You know how to read it. The rest is just shapes. I called Ray from a gas station outside Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Still got room in that shop? Lorne Kessler. Been wondering when you'd call. You were wondering? Man who builds the way you build doesn't stay in one place after his life falls apart. You're either the type who sits in the wreckage or the type who drives. I figured you for a driver. I'll be there tomorrow. I'll leave the light on. Apalachicola sits on a bay at the mouth of a river that runs down from Georgia. The air smells like salt and pine and oyster shells. The light is different from Minnesota. Softer, longer, the kind of light that makes you forget what cold feels like. Ray's shop was a corrugated metal building on Water Street, 50 yards from the bay. Inside, half-finished boats, the smell of marine varnish, hand tools arranged on pegboard the way Gunnar had arranged his. Ray was 67, built like a dock piling, arms tanned from decades of outdoor work. He handed me a cup of coffee and pointed to a 22-foot wooden skiff on Sawhorses. Planking needs to be finished. White cedar. Think you can handle it? I ran my thumb along the grain. The wood pushed back. I can handle it. For 6 months, I worked in Ray's shop and said nothing about Minnesota. He didn't ask. Boat builders, like timber framers, understand that a man's silence is his own business. We worked side by side the way Gunnar and I had worked. Long hours, few words, the tools doing the talking. I rented a cottage on the bay with a screened porch and a dock. Mornings, I drank coffee and watched pelicans work the shallows. Evenings, I sat on the porch with my notebooks open, not reading them, just holding them. 30 years of work in my hands. Proof that I'd built something real, even if the people I'd built it for didn't want it anymore. The phone rang sometimes. Paul Lindgren with updates on the investigation. The state case against Trent was moving forward. 19 properties. Class action settlement talks. Trent's attorneys were stalling, filing motions, doing what expensive attorneys do when the facts aren't on their side. I listened, said I understood, and went back to planking the skiff. Bryce never called. Not once. I didn't call him either. The last time I'd seen him was in my shop doorway, blazer and cologne, telling me his mother was happy. Some nights I thought about the house on the bluff, the cathedral ceiling I'd raised alone, the stone fireplace built from beach rock, the white pine mantle that showed its grain from across the room. I wondered if Trent had ripped that out too, replaced it with something manufactured, something that looked right but wouldn't last. Then I'd close my eyes and listen to the waves against the dock and remind myself that I'd spent 12 years building a house for a woman who valued speed over substance, and 23 years raising a son who chose a borrowed blazer over an honest trade. The wood held. The people didn't. That was a year ago. Then the phone rang at dawn on a Tuesday morning. Diane's number. The first time she'd called since the divorce. FBI raided the house. Trent in handcuffs. Bryce facing federal charges. Come home. Please. I watched a pelican dive and come up with nothing. The coffee had gone cold in my hand. The bay was flat and gray in the early light. Somewhere in Minnesota, my son was sitting in a room with federal agents, and the signatures he'd put on those documents without reading them were now the evidence being used against him. I'd told him to get a lawyer. A year ago, standing in the doorway of a shop I no longer owned, I'd told him exactly what to do. He didn't listen. Kids never do when the advice comes from the person they've decided to outgrow. I set the coffee down and went inside. Found my phone, scrolled to Paul Lindgren's number. I need a criminal defense attorney, I said. Not for me, for my son. Paul was quiet for a moment. I heard about the raids this morning. How bad? Federal charges? That's all I know. I'll make some calls. I hung up and stood in the kitchen of my rented cottage, 1,000 miles from the life I'd built and lost. The notebooks sat on the shelf by the window, same as they had in every place I'd ever lived. 30 years of a man's work. Every joint, every problem, every lesson, Gunnar, taught me about going deeper than what shows. My son was in trouble because he never learned that lesson, and the woman who helped him unlearn it was asking me to come fix what she'd broken. I picked up my keys and walked to the truck. 3 weeks after I started working in Ray's shop, I found my own space. The old Whitfield boathouse sat at the east end of the waterfront. Corrugated tin roof, cypress framing gone silver from salt air, bay doors wide enough to roll a hull through. The place had processed oysters for 40 years before the beds went thin, and Charlie Whitfield, 80 years old, retired oysterman, fingers bent from 40 years of working the tongs, stopped coming down to the water. He rented it to me for $400 a month. What kind of boats? He asked, handing over the key on a ring made from braided dock line. Whatever people need built. Skiffs, day sailors, anything that holds together on open water. He looked at the Minnesota plates on my truck, then at my hands. You know what you're doing? I've been working with wood since I was 18. He didn't ask anything else. Didn't need to. In a town built on oysters and fishing and not much more, a man's hands told you what his mouth wouldn't. I still worked mornings with Ray. His commissions paid the rent while mine built the reputation. But the afternoons and evenings were mine. 2 weeks to convert the space. I swept out years of oyster shells and dried mud, pulled rusted processing equipment off the walls, patched the roof where salt and wind had opened gaps in the tin, built a workbench against the south wall from cypress planks I salvaged from a dock teardown on the river, bolted it to the concrete floor so it wouldn't shift under a mallet strike. Hung pegboard along the north wall and laid out my tools from the leather roll I'd carried out of Minnesota. Broadhead chisels, corner chisels, drac knives, a Japanese dovetail saw, hand planes ranked by size. Same arrangement, Gunnar had taught me. Tools where your hand expects them every time. Coffee pot on a plywood shelf near the entrance. It ran from 5 in the morning until I locked the bay doors at dark. Those doors faced east across the water. Mornings, I opened them before dawn, and the Gulf came in, salt, the slap of water against pilings, light turning the bay from black to gray to blue while I worked. In Duluth, my shop windows had faced a parking lot and a highway overpass. Here, I could look up from a chisel and see open water to the horizon. My chest loosened the first morning and never tightened back. The cottage sat where a side street dead-ended at the waterfront, tucked between two live oaks heavy with Spanish moss. Clapboard walls, tin roof, a screened porch facing the bay with a dock that ran 30 feet over the shallows. I built an Adirondack chair from leftover cypress my second week and set it on the porch with a side table for my coffee. Every morning, same seat, same view. Brown pelicans diving the shallows. Oystermen heading out in flat-bottomed skiffs. Tides instead of court dates. Salt air instead of deposition rooms. Nobody in Apalachicola asked where I came from or why I'd left. The town measured a man by what he could do with his hands. I understood that language. My first solo commission came from Wallace Thibodeau, a 73-year-old retired shrimper who needed new planking on a 16-foot flat bottom he'd owned since the Carter administration. His grandson hauled it to my shop on a trailer so rusted the fenders were held on with baling wire. Grandpa says if you can fix it, he'll pay fair. If you can't, he says, sink it in the bay and don't tell him. Tell him I'll fix it. The hull was white cedar over white oak ribs, half the planks split or punky from sun and salt. I pulled the bad wood, shaped new planks on the workbench, and fitted them to the ribs the way I'd fit timber to a frame, reading the grain, finding the curve the wood wanted to follow, letting the material do what it was already trying to do. Boat building ran on the same principle Gunnar drilled into me. You don't force wood into a shape. You find the one it already wants. Wallace came by every afternoon to watch. Third day, he brought a lawn chair and a cooler of beer and sat inside the bay doors until I finished for the evening. Your hands were different from the boys around here, he said. Slower, like you're listening to something. The wood tells you where to cut, if you're paying attention. He nodded and opened another beer. My daddy used to say the same about oyster beds. Listen to the water. It tells you where the shells are. Word moved through town the way it moves through any place small enough that people notice each other. Fishermen walked past the open bay doors and saw a man working with hand tools, no power equipment, shaping planks the way their grandfathers had. They stopped. They watched. Some came back with boats that needed fixing. By September, I had 4 commissions running. Wallace's skiff, rebuilt stem to stern. A dinghy for a retired couple from Tallahassee who kept a sailboat at the marina. 2 sets of custom oars for a kayak guide who ran tours through the river delta. Small jobs, good wood. The kind of work that leaves your hands tired and your mind quiet. Linda Parsons, who ran the cafe on Commerce Street where I ate breakfast most mornings, gave me the name that stuck. She said it to a table of regulars one morning while I stood at the counter waiting for my eggs. Man builds boats all day, shows up here looking like he's got a dinner reservation. How does he do it? Her husband Gil looked me over from behind his coffee cup. Gentleman carpenter. Linda pointed at him. That's it. That's what he is. I paid for my eggs and didn't argue. My blood pressure dropped 20 points by August. The new doctor at Weems Memorial said, whatever I'd changed, don't change it back. I sketched in my leather notebooks again. Not timber joints, boat ribs, keel profiles, scarf joints for hull planking. Different shapes, same pencil, same language, same hand moving across the page. The new notebooks sat on the cottage shelf next to 30 years of older ones. New work beside old work, with nothing between them except 1,000 miles of highway I'd never drive north on again. Evenings I sat on the screened porch and listened to the bay go dark. No listing prices quoted at the dinner table. No Pinterest boards. No cologne. No borrowed blazers. Just water against the dock pilings and the last light fading over the Gulf. Then the calls started from Minnesota. Not from Diane. Not from Bryce. From the trades. Tom Pressman, the Duluth building inspector who'd first asked me to assess a Marquis property, called on a Wednesday in late September. Lakeshore Drive House, he said. The one where they cut the beam for the ductwork. Section you flagged. It let go. Second floor dropped 6 inches before the framing around it caught the load. Homeowner was standing right above. Came down with the ceiling on top of him. I stood in my workshop with the phone against my ear, looking out the bay doors at flat water. He'll live, broken collarbone, 3 fractured ribs. His wife pulled him out. She's got a lawyer now. Tom paused. Park Point property is worse. Foundation wall cracked 3 inches after the first hard frost. City condemned the house. Family had to evacuate at 11 at night. 2 kids in pajamas, nowhere to go. 2 families. 2 houses I'd written 14-page reports on. Measurements and photographs documenting every shortcut hidden behind fresh drywall. 9 subcontractors filed liens this month, Tom said. Hector Molina, the foundation contractor, remember? Piled on 3 properties at once. $140,000. He's got half the trades in Duluth organized. Total liens are north of $600,000. And Trent, running out of air? 7 hard money loans, all past maturity or close to it. My guy at the county recorder's office says the interest alone is $50,000 a month. Properties sitting empty because word's out. Nobody in the county will buy a Marquis renovation. I watched an osprey circle twice over the shallows and fly off without diving. You could come back, Tom said. Testify in the civil case. Your reports are the foundation of everything the state's building. The reports don't need me standing next to them. Measurements don't change depending on who reads them out loud. Hector filed complaints with the state licensing board and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division last week. This is going federal, Lorne. Then the feds know where to find me. We hung up. A week later, Ray slid his phone across the workbench without a word. A Duluth Tribune article on the screen. Fraud allegations against Marquis luxury renovations. Photo of the Lakeshore showcase with a condemned notice stapled to the front door. 6.2 million listing. Boarded windows. I read it and pushed the phone back. Not your fight anymore, Ray said. Never was a fight. I opened the walls and wrote down what I saw. The walls did the rest. 2 more calls came in October. Pete Lindquist, a framing contractor I'd worked beside for 15 years in Duluth, told me Trent had stopped paying everyone. Suppliers, subcontractors, even his office staff. The Lakeshore property sat empty. Someone had broken in and stripped the copper plumbing. Mike Haroldson, an electrician, owed $60,000 for wiring 3 Marquis renovations. Called to say Hector Molina was pressing the FBI complaint, providing bank records and work orders, naming every contractor who'd been stiffed. Hector says he'll drag every last document into the light if it takes 10 years, Mike said. He won't need 10 years, I said. The structure's failing on its own. He just has to wait. I hung up and went back to the boat on my workbench. A 24-foot day sailor for a retired judge in Carabel. White oak frames, cedar planking, a keel I'd shaped from a live oak. A storm had dropped across Highway 98 2 months back. Good wood, sound grain. The kind of material that holds for 100 years if the joints are right. I didn't call Diane, didn't call Bryce, didn't call Trent's attorneys or the state investigators or the families whose ceilings had come down on them. I'd written the reports. I'd measured every beam, documented every cut corner, photographed every code violation hidden behind new finishes. I'd told my son to get a lawyer, and he'd walked out in a borrowed blazer. No amount of calling changes what's already happening inside the walls. I drove to the workshop, sat in the truck with the engine off for 10 minutes, then went inside and opened the bay doors. Paul Lindgren called back at noon. He'd reached Rachel Okonwo, a federal defense attorney in Minneapolis with 20 years of white-collar experience. She needs to talk to Bryce directly, Paul said. Today, if possible, I'll get him to call. One more thing. The raids were coordinated out of the FBI's Minneapolis field office. 4 properties hit at the same time: Trent's business office, 2 active renovation sites, and the Lakeshore showcase. Agents carried out computers, financial records going back 5 years. 23 counts of wire fraud. Each email, each wire transfer, each loan application is a separate count. 20 years maximum per count. Plus reckless endangerment for selling compromised homes to families. I stood in the doorway of my workshop. The bay was flat and gray under low clouds. And Bryce? That's what Rachel needs to assess. If his name is on company documents as an officer, he didn't need to finish. I called my son 3 times. Voicemail, texted him Rachel's name and number. No response. The Duluth Tribune ran the story at 2 that afternoon. I read it on my phone at my workbench, a half-shaped cedar plank in front of me. The photo showed Trent Marquis in handcuffs being walked from the Lakeshore showcase. Driving loafers, no socks, blazer wrinkled from agents pulling him out of bed at 6 in the morning. 2 agents held his arms. Behind him, a heated driveway sat wet with melted snow while the rest of the street stayed frozen white. The driveway worked. Nothing else about the property did. 8 agents at the Lakeshore house alone. Reckless endangerment charges tied to the joist collapse that broke Dave Kinnick's collarbone and the foundation failure that forced a family with 2 children out at 11 at night in their pajamas. The condemned notice on the showcase's front door showed up clear in the photo, stapled to a fiberglass door painted to look like wood. The article named Hector Molina as the complainant whose invoices and formal FBI complaints drove the federal investigation forward. The foundation contractor, who'd been owed $140,000 and wouldn't stop filing until every last document saw daylight. I set the phone down and picked up my handplane, drew it along the cedar. Curls fell to the concrete. The shop smelled like cedar shavings and marine varnish. Florida heat pressed through the open bay doors, the air thick with salt, a boat engine running somewhere out on the water. I worked the plank for 2 hours, measuring twice, planing once, the way I'd always worked. The repetition held me together the way it always had. Ray Burris walked in around 3. He'd seen the news. "You all right?" My son's name is on those documents. He leaned against the doorframe, came back 10 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee and said nothing else about it. Diane called at 4:30, but different voice from this morning's panic. I recognized it. 28 years of reading her moods the way I read grain. "Where are you?" she said. "Same place I've been since I left. I need you to come home. You said that this morning, and you called a lawyer instead of getting on a plane." She told me what happened at the house. FBI vans on the street at dawn. Agents with badges and a warrant. 3 hours inside, room by room, the study, the bedroom, the kitchen, I'd framed by hand. Agents in blue windbreakers boxing up Trent's files while she stood in the corner of her own home. They found records connecting his renovation income to their household accounts. An agent told her she was listed as a household beneficiary of fraud proceeds. Every dollar that flowed through their accounts while Trent lived there now sat under federal review. The mortgage was clean. My mortgage paid off 8 years early, but everything Trent added after moving in was funded with money that turned out to be evidence. Karen Johansson stood on her porch in her bathrobe watching the whole thing. Diane's friend from choir, 3 houses down. The Andersons had their phones out, recording. The whole neighborhood saw the FBI vans Lorne. Every last one of them. Trent's neighbors now, not mine. This is your fault. Her voice went flat and hard. You left. You walked away from your family and drove to Florida while your son fell in with a criminal. If you had stayed, if you had been here, none of this would have happened. I held the phone and let her talk. Same as I'd always done. You knew his houses were rotten. You wrote those reports. You told Bryce the structure was bad. And then you packed your truck and drove south and let it all come down on us. You filed for divorce, Diane. You brought Trent to our dinner table. You stood there while our son told me I wasn't enough. I didn't know he was a criminal. You didn't want to know. Do you understand what this means for me? My job. My reputation. Linda Thiel called the dental office today and asked if I was a person of interest. The dentist's wife. The woman whose kitchen started everything. Carrara marble, heated floors, a 6-burner range worth more than our truck. The life Diane measured against her own until the gap pushed her toward a man who promised to close it. I need money, she said. Trent's accounts are frozen. Mine are frozen. I can't access a thing. Get a lawyer. I'm talking to you. You're talking at me. I'm not the one who fixes what you chose to break. Not anymore. Her breathing changed. Tight, sharp sounds through the phone. I found Bryce an attorney, I said. Federal Defense, Minneapolis. Have him call her. He won't answer his phone. He will when he's scared enough. I hung up. Set the phone face down on the workbench. Ran the hand plane along the cedar 6 more times. Long strokes, even pressure. Curls collecting on the floor. Bryce called at 9:15 that night. I was on the screened porch, lights off, listening to water against the dock pilings. When his voice came through the phone, the performance was gone. The clipped confidence, the business talk, the rehearsed authority of a 24-year-old who'd been handed car keys and a blazer and told it made him somebody. What came through was a sound I hadn't heard since he was 9 and fell through the ice on Chester Creek. The tight, thin breathing of a kid who understood something bad was happening and couldn't make it stop. Dad, I'm here. 2 agents came to my apartment this morning. They had my name on a list. Junior partner and project manager of Marquis Luxury Renovations. He swallowed hard enough to hear. They showed me copies. 12 inspection reports with my signature. Lender draw requests for renovation milestones that never got finished. Completion certificates for projects still sitting half done. I didn't read a single one. I signed where Trent pointed. What did the agents say? That signing a federal document without reading it doesn't remove liability. That every signature is a separate count. The bay was black through the screen. No moon. Past the breakwater, a channel marker blinked red. Dad, you gotta help me. I just signed where he told me to sign. They're saying federal charges. I found you a lawyer. Rachel Okonkwo, federal defense attorney out of Minneapolis. She handles cases like this. You call her first thing tomorrow. What do I do? Tell her everything, every document, every conversation with Trent, every property you walked through, every paper you signed. All of it. Hold nothing back. What if it's too late? It's not too late for a lawyer. Some charges may hold. Rachel will know which ones can be fought and which ones can't. You told me, his voice dropped, a year ago, in your shop. You said, get a lawyer, and I walked out in that blazer like I knew better. Yes, I should have listened. Yes, frogs in the marsh, water on the pilings, the sounds of a place that knew nothing about courtrooms or handcuffs or a son who'd signed his name 12 times on papers he never bothered to read. I told you the house was rotten, Bryce. You laughed. Nothing came back through the line. No defense, no excuse. His breathing, the silence between breaths, the sound of a kid standing on thin ice looking down. Call Rachel in the morning. I'll be here. I set the phone on the arm of the Adirondack chair and let the night take the porch. The bay lay dark and flat through the screen. No pelicans at this hour. No boats. Water and sky and the black line between them. I sat without moving. The frogs quit around 2. The air cooled and the first mosquitoes found the screen and bounced off it. Somewhere past the breakwater, a fish broke the surface. A single splash, then nothing. At some hour, I stopped counting. The gray came in from the east and spread across the water until the gulf turned flat and blue in the early light. My son was 24 with his name on 12 federal documents he'd signed without reading. My ex-wife's world had come apart in front of the neighbors she'd spent 2 decades comparing herself to. The man they'd both chosen over me was in a holding cell wearing loafers with no socks. I'd done what I could, written the structural reports, warned my son a year before the frame gave way, found him an attorney when it did, the slow, unglamorous work of a man who checks what's underneath and tells the truth about what he finds. The pelicans came with the sun, 3 of them working the shallows in a line, diving and coming up with whatever the water offered. I watched until the coffee was cold and the light had gone full blue across the bay. Then I walked to the workshop, opened the doors, picked up where I'd left off on the cedar plank. The cedar held firm under the plane. Sound grain. I had work to do. The federal indictment dropped 3 weeks after the raids. 23 counts of wire fraud against Trent. Reckless endangerment for selling compromised homes to families. Paul Lindgren called that afternoon. U.S. Attorney named Marquis Luxury Renovations a criminal enterprise, he said. Trent Marquis, principal. Bryce listed on 12 of the 23 counts. I set down the handplane. What's Rachel saying? The motion to separate Bryce's case is moving forward. She's pushing reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. Bryce testifies about how Trent ran things, who directed what, how the paperwork moved. His chances? Federal conviction rate is 93%. Those signatures are on paper, but cooperation helps. I looked out the bay doors. The gulf sat flat under low clouds. A pelican perched on a piling, motionless. Paul said the prosecution planned to lead with the families. Dave Kinnick, the teacher whose ceiling collapsed. The family from Park Point, 2 children carried out in pajamas when the foundation wall gave way. The kind of testimony that turns a financial case into something a jury carries home. The FBI's forensic accountant, Dr. Ellen Vasquez, out of the Minneapolis field office, had spent 3 months reconstructing Trent's books. At the preliminary hearing, she pulled his finances apart in open court. She described the operation as a man running downhill who can't stop because stopping means falling. 5 years of books exposed. Revenue that looked like millions, was debt cycling through accounts. Every dollar in went out to service debt on properties already flipped. New sales covered old loans. When the sales stopped, everything got called at once. Total exposure above $4 million. Not one property carried positive equity after subtracting liens, outstanding debt, and the repair costs documented in my inspection reports. The prosecution entered those reports alongside the state engineer's assessment. Every measurement matched within a quarter inch by 2 independent evaluations. All company assets seized in a single week. Trucks, equipment, office lease, the sign on the building. The leased Audi W. Bryce's trophy was towed from his apartment lot at 7 in the morning. He watched from his window in sweatpants as they loaded it onto a flatbed. The car that proved he'd leveled up hauled away on a hook while his neighbors left for work. The Lakeshore showcase sat condemned. Plywood over windows. Chain across the driveway. I worked through the afternoon. Long strokes of the hand plane along cedar planking, curls collecting on concrete. The day sailor's hull coming together on the Sawhorses. White oak ribs, cedar skin, joints fitted so tight you couldn't slip paper between them. Work that would hold on open water when it mattered. Rachel Okonkwo called the next morning. Prosecution offered a cooperation deal, she said. Bryce testifies about Trent's internal operations. Wire fraud charges drop from 12 counts to 3. Recommended sentence, 18 to 36 months. Federal time, 85% served. No early release. My son, the 1.5 year minimum in a federal facility because he signed papers without reading them. No priors, Rachel said. 24 years old, with nothing on paper except a speeding ticket and 12 federal documents he signed without reading. That helps, but the signatures are on the documents. That won't change. How's he doing? No car, no income, GPS ankle monitor. His mother calls 6 times a day. He picks up about half. I hung up and stood in the workshop doorway for a long time. Salt air, low tide smell. A heron standing in the shallows on one leg, waiting for something to move. I wrote the retainer check that week, $30,000 from savings built over 32 years of honest work. Money earned one beam at a time, now spent keeping my son out of prison. The partnership that gave him car keys and a blazer now gave him an ankle bracelet and a defense attorney his father had to pay for. Hector Molina became the prosecution's most important witness. His unpaid invoices were entered as exhibits. Paul told me that months before the raids, Hector had confronted Trent at the Lakeshore showcase. Grand opening. Walked in with a manila folder, waving invoices overhead, shouting about rotten foundations and broken promises until security dragged him out in front of 200 guests. What looked like a meltdown at the time was a man who'd done the work and refused to let the theft of it go unanswered. The Duluth Tribune photographed Hector in his workshop. 61 years old, arms shaped by decades of pouring concrete, standing next to the filing cabinet where he'd kept copies of every document for 40 years, work orders, certified mail receipts, photographs of completed foundations that Trent covered with drywall and forgot about. I did the work, he told the reporter. I poured the foundations. I did it right. And this man took my labor and buried it under drywall and lies and called it luxury. 9 subcontractors testified in the preliminary proceedings. Electricians, plumbers, framers, HVAC crews. Men who did the work and never saw payment while Trent used their labor to inflate property values on paper. Every unpaid invoice, another document, the prosecution stacked on the table. Minneapolis television ran the story at 6, 10, and 11. The cable outlet picked it up by the end of the week. Luxury house flipper, FBI raids, families displaced. 3-part series on the local news. The coverage went national within days. Diane's world came apart along the exact lines her ambition had drawn. The dental practice put her on unpaid leave the week after the raids, patients canceling. Insurance companies calling. Linda Thiel, Dr. Thiel's wife, the woman whose kitchen started everything, called the office to ask if Diane was a person of interest. 16 years at that front desk, and the woman she'd spent every one of them comparing herself to now wanted her name nowhere near the conversation. The house on the bluff, my house, sat under federal asset review. Every improvement Trent made with fraud money was subject to forfeiture. She couldn't sell, couldn't refinance, couldn't touch the equity in a house she'd taken from me and given to a man who filled it with stolen money. Paul told me about the Pinterest boards on a Thursday call. Prosecution subpoenaed her social media, he said. Half the pins are Trent's listings. Comments naming specific properties and renovation details dated across the fraud timeline. They're using the boards to show she tracked his business. Every kitchen she'd admired. Every property she'd held up as proof my life wasn't enough. Each pin now time-stamped in a federal investigation. Karen Johansson, choir friend, 3 houses down, stopped returning calls. The Andersons posted their FBI footage to the neighborhood Facebook group. Margaret Dunn, the college roommate whose husband's vacations Diane had tracked for a decade, sent a message Paul passed along without comment. I think we need some space. Space. What Diane wanted from my life for 28 years. Now she had more of it than she could stand. Wallace Thibodeau sat in my bay doors one afternoon while I fared the hull with long plane strokes. That boy of yours, he said, going through it. He opened a beer and watched the water. My grandson did a year in county at 22. Something stupid, came out different. Some boys don't learn what the easy way costs until they get the bill. I ran my palm along the Cedar, fair and true, under my hand. No soft spots. I picked up the hand plane and went back to the hull. Still invested? Hit like and rate my story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Tell me why. I read them all. Dawn came in gray, then blue. I sat in the Adirondack chair on the screened porch with coffee black and hot, watching 3 brown pelicans cruise the shallows single file. The bay was glass, no wind. The kind of morning where the water holds still long enough to see the bottom. The chair was cypress I'd shaped from dock salvage. Square joints, no fasteners, the back angled at 12 degrees, the pitch that holds a man through a long morning. The side table held my cup and a leather notebook open to a blank page. I'd been sketching since first light. A scarf joint for a 30-foot sailboat hull. My first commission that size. Henry Calloway, a retired oceanographer from Tallahassee, white beard and sun-darkened arms, wanted a blue water boat built the old way. Hand-shaped frames, copper-riveted planking, a keel cut from live oak so dense it sank in water. 2 years of work, minimum. The kind of project Gunnar would have understood. The pencil moved across the page the way it always moved. Clean lines, right angles. 2 pieces of timber locked by the precision of the cut alone. I closed the notebook and drank my coffee. 6 months since the raids. I drove to Minneapolis the week it happened. Sat with Bryce and Rachel in a conference room for 2 hours. Said what needed saying. Then drove south again and picked up where I'd left off. The workshop waited 50 yards down the waterfront. Bay doors open already. Morning light reaching the workbench where yesterday's cedar shavings still curled on the concrete. The air inside would carry red cedar and salt and the marine varnish I'd brushed on the day sailor's hull 2 days ago. Tools hung on pegboard by size. Chisels oiled in the leather roll. Coffee pot running since 5. No debt. No mortgage. No contempt at the dinner table. No rot behind the walls. Somewhere past the breakwater, an oyster boat engine turned over and caught its idle. The pension came on the 1st of every month. The boat commissions covered everything else. Wallace's rebuilt skiff sat in the harbor, tight as the day I planked her. 4 more boats in the queue, and word still moving through town the way it moves through any place small enough to care about the work of a man's hands. Bryce's case was moving through the federal system. Rachel had the cooperation deal in place. He'd testify. He'd serve time. He'd come out the other side with whatever he chose to build from there. I couldn't cut that joint for him. Diane had the house on the bluff. My house. Cathedral ceiling, white oak trusses, stone fireplace laid from beach rock. The frame would hold for 200 years, regardless of who lived inside it. Good joinery outlasts the people who live inside it. Pelican dove and came up with a fish, silver flashing in its bill. The bird tipped its head back and swallowed and sat on the water. I watched it for a long time. I finished the coffee, set the cup on the side table, picked up the notebook, and walked the shell path to the workshop. Wallace was in his lawn chair inside the bay doors, facing the water. "Morning, Carpenter." "Morning, Wallace." Bay doors open to the Gulf. Blue water to the horizon. Cedar on the Sawhorses. Tools where my hand expected them. I build things that last.